Hi everyone. On behalf of VanCAF, Vancouver Comic and Arts Festival, I'd like to welcome you to this conversation with author Kiku Hughes, who's here with me today on the call. Kiku's debut graphic novel, Displacement, which I have right here, is a magical realist story about a Japanese-American teenager who is pulled back in time to witness her grandmother's experiences in Japanese-American incarceration camps during the Second World War. This book is a mixture of fact, fiction, history, and memory, as inspired by Kiku's own family stories. Displacement is published by First Second Books and is now available at your local independent bookstore. So today, Kiku joins us from the Seattle area in Washington on Duwamish territories, and I am located further north in Vancouver, Canada, on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories. And for those of you who don't know who I am, my name is Erica Isomura, and I am a writer, an editor, and your moderator for today. And my connection to this story is that my family was also interned, but in British Columbia, Canada. More specifically, my Japanese Canadian grandparents and great-grandparents were detained at Hastings Park Racecourse in Vancouver, Tashme, Greenwood, and New Denver. So many of these communities don't exist in the same way that they once did when they were camps, so to speak. And in Kiku's book, we get to learn about her grandmother's story at the Tan Fran Detention Center in San Bruno, California, and Topaz Relocation Center, which is in central Utah. So I am very excited to be here today chatting with Kiku about her debut book, as well as reclaiming family history, queer ancestors, and the really important significance of these stories today. So welcome, Kiku.
Thanks so much. That was an amazing intro. Thank you.
First of all, congratulations. The book is so beautiful, and it was amazing to be able to read it before it came out. And I read that you've said that this is a story that you've wanted to tell for as long as you can remember. So I'd love to hear more about that. I'd love to hear how and when this idea for this book came about.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think maybe I misspoke when I said tell the story as long as I can remember. I think as a child I really wanted to hear the story because there was so much that I knew but didn't know, and I think a lot of yonsei especially can sort of relate to that. Mm-hmm. The idea that you sort of have this understanding of what happened, but also there's so much that is sort of left unsaid. So I think, yeah, that sort of, I wanted to hear the story, and in lieu of that, I guess it became telling the story as well as I could. Yeah, so I think a big part of that is just sort of that longing for that missing information. Yeah, it's a big part of sort of how displacement came together as like a narrative arc. And then of course, the 2016 election in the States was a big motivator for sort of actually writing and starting to like really nail down what exactly this book was going to look like, and sort of motivating myself to actually get something out there, because the parallels, you know, they didn't start in 2016, but certainly they were more blatant in 2016, I think.
Mm-hmm. Definitely a lot of heaviness throughout the book, obviously. Yeah. With the content and with the political context for today, which I hope to kind of go more into. I'd love to hear, since this is your first book, some of your maybe highlights or favorite moments in creating in this process.
Yeah, this is my first book, and also I think it's going to be very unique in that it was very research driven. I think a lot of the highlights just came from those little moments where you find exactly the piece of information that you're looking for. Or in my case, like I would stumble upon like the entire high school yearbook that my grandmother's high school at Topaz is called Ramblings, and Topaz High School, their entire yearbook is online to just flip through. So I got to sort of see, you know, her class and the sort of wry humor that her classmates sort of put into their comments and stuff on in the yearbook, as well as like the Topaz Times, the newspaper that was made by Nikkei in the camps. That's all digital now. So I was actually really lucky that I was doing the book now because there's so much available online. So those were probably my favorite moments, just being able to find these little pieces of history and also sharing that with my family was really special because a lot of it my mom had never seen either. So it's kind of, those were some of my favorite parts, I think. Just, I don't know, just like seeing these little imprints left throughout history was really cool.
Totally. That's awesome. Yeah, what an amazing family project, hey? And to
Yeah.
be able to that to your family, I think, you know, it's really common, I think, for people in our generation to not have heard these stories, and for maybe even our parents to not even know them because they didn't think to ask. Or so I think it's really powerful to be doing that work.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of what this book is sort of about, is sort of exploring the reasons why these sorts of stories are kind of left unsaid or unshared. Yeah.
I'm curious about some of the challenges maybe that kind of came up. Like you mentioned some of the access to information. Were there holes or gaps that you were frustrated to fill, or other things that just maybe like just the process of writing a book?
Yeah, you know, I'm lucky because a lot of things had been semi-recently declassified by the U.S. government. So, for instance, there was a whole book of Dorothea Lange photography, like WRA photography, and she was commissioned to sort of take pictures of the camps, but anything that had, you know, guns or barbed wire was sort of censored by the government for a very long time. Yeah, I was lucky that now it's sort of been released finally. And so I had more access to resources than, say, like my parents' generation would have at my age. But there was still a lot, like cameras were not allowed in camp, especially in the first few years. So there was a lot of visual information that I didn't have, which made it hard because it's a graphic novel. So there was a lot of like little details that I found myself really at a lack, like, you know, what did the beds look like? What was the lighting situation? You know, trying to figure out exactly how the restrooms looked, you know, things like very little details, but that still felt very important for sort of conveying the situation. Yeah, so yeah, in that way, like the absence of photography in camp sort of leads to this very long, like lasting effect of like robbing us of that sort of visual information. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw on your Twitter that you had even like, was it you that had rebuilt model demos, or you had?
Yeah, I actually used SketchUp, which is a freeware 3D modeling service, to really, it was very basic, but that was just to construct sort of the camp layout and get the perspective right and everything. Yeah.
Wow, so much work.
Yeah, it was very helpful though. And I was able to, luckily I was able to visit the Topaz Museum in Delta, Utah, which is a really incredible museum. And they have, you know, a little scale model that I was able to take a picture of at the time and sort of use that to sort of figure out where everything was. And they also have a rebuilt model of a barrack that you could sort of walk through, which was super useful. So projects like that are really important, and I'm very grateful to them.
Totally. Yeah. I think another thing I really appreciated of your book is that so much of it, as we've talked about, is centered around memory and, you know, whether a lack thereof or an institutional erasure. And in the mainstream, you know, at least when I was growing up, I didn't really hear about these stories, even my own family stories, or in social studies really, about Japanese Canadian internment, yet let alone American internment. But I think we hear even less about queer and trans histories within our community. And so one thing that was so exciting for me was that there was the inclusion of this narrative with your character and with another character named May. I think I like screamed when I saw that in the story, because, you know, like, I think that there is kind of this one, you know, like it's mentioned in the book, there's this kind of model minority story about Japanese Americans and Canadians pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and it's not really like we don't all have the same experiences though. So I'd love to hear, every camp is so different. Everyone's, how they answered question, was it 27, 28?
Yeah.
It was so different. Men versus women's experiences, children, so I'd love, like, if do you want to talk, would you be willing to talk more about queer Nikkei history and what that was like
Yeah,
to research, or?
for
Yeah.
sure. And also to your point, and I didn't mean to mention this also in the last question about this sort of creating a monolithic experience. That was another sort of challenge, but also exciting opportunity in researching for the book, is sort of finding all the different ways, because like you say, everybody had a different experience, from camp to camp, from family to family. Like there were so many unique positions and opinions. And I think, yeah, in history and even within our own community, I think there's an emphasis on this one sort of stoic in the face of hardship story that is really not, I don't think it's very helpful to the community and to the nation and to the world. I think it's much more interesting, and it's much more humanizing to really tell the stories of very, very different people that existed in camp. Yeah, and so like you said, I'm a lesbian, so part of it was just that I was like, I know that we've always existed, so I'm putting this in here. I don't really care what else. But there was, I was lucky enough to find, Densho had done some research on finding queer histories in camp. There was a man named Jiro Onuma, who is, I think, the only really documented gay man in camp. So finding out about his story was really, really beautiful. And there's photos of him and his boyfriend in camp, and it's very nice. There's also figures like Mia Yamamoto, who is a trans woman who was born in Poston camp. So, she wouldn't have been old enough to like have a relationship or anything in camp. She was like a baby, an infant, but still, it just goes to show there's always been LGBT people throughout history, and it's hard to find stories, especially in a situation where it's already so heavily censored and people, are already in such a situation that it's hard to, really ever be your authentic self. But I think, like I said, we've always been here, and and we've all found ways to find each other. So
Yeah, that was really beautiful. Yeah, and I think kind of what you're speaking to in terms of, the oppression and the challenges faced by Japanese Americans. I think the other thing that was really significant to me that comes out in your story is how these experiences and these struggles are ongoing. Maybe they're not faced by the Japanese American community in the same way. But like you mentioned, obviously trans women have really different experiences than, like than cis people in camps, for instance, or cis Japanese Americans. And in your story, you also mention how, Kiku's mother is often shown watching the news, and you mentioned the presidential election. And there's one scene where she is watching as a politician, this happened in real life, refers to the incarceration as a precedent for Latinx migrants and Muslim migrants coming to the United States. And in another chapter, she also talks about the model minority myth and things that were used to pit Asian Americans against Black communities during the Civil Rights Movement. So I'd love to hear more about your decision to be including that in the story, and also why the story is so important in light of these events that are happening, like literally right now.
Yeah, I really endeavored to make sure I included direct quotes from the Trump administration and from his campaign, because, yeah, I mean, they specifically mention Japanese American incarceration as precedent for, keeping families in cages now, which, should be much more alarming than apparently it was to people, because I think, yeah, part of the reason that I think telling this story is still important, is because America sort of admitted, they had a mea culpa with Reagan. They were like, this was wrong. We did wrong. Even Ronald Reagan thinks this was wrong, and that's saying something. So I think Japanese Americans, now it's our responsibility to say, you said this was wrong, and yet this is the exact same situation. You can't have it both ways. So yeah, I think drawing that parallel is really important because of, the hypocrisy within the country that, we are still speaking in large part about Japanese American incarceration as something that was wrong. And I think it's sort of our job as Nikkei to really highlight that hypocrisy. And in terms of the model minority myth and things like that, I think that is a conversation that I really think is important, especially within Asian American circles. So that is really more specifically within, speaking to fellow Asian Americans, because I think there is a temptation to, take this sort of positive racism and say, yes, this is me. I'm smart, I'm good at math, I'm like all that stuff. Like, this is, I'm going to use this as part of my identity because it's not, I don't know, doesn't make me feel bad necessarily. But I think, understanding the context about why that myth came about is really important, especially in a time when, for instance, there was an Asian American officer who was witnessing the murder of George Floyd. There's a Japanese American owned ICE detention center in California. Like,
wow.
We are not absolved of that sort of, we are complicit as a community when we don't speak out against our own community members committing violent acts against other minorities. So it's all connected.
Totally. And I think it also speaks to like how, like in your story, there's I think the shooting of a disabled Japanese American man in the camp, which shocks the camp. I found those imagery in that story very compelling because that was something that I hadn't heard that story before or anything about those histories. And I think that it's kind of just like what we've also said is just like everyone's individual experiences are also so different. So even what does it mean to be a model minority when that's not even something that has space for everyone, or like, what I mean? Like, it's not something that we all kind of even fit into. Like, obviously in the camps, Japanese American experiences are different than maybe Okinawan American experiences, or other folks who were multiracial today. There's an intermarriage in our community of so many, at least in Canada, I'm sure also in the United States, into other communities. And, we don't really get to hear as many stories about like Black Nikkei or Indigenous Nikkei. And so.
Exactly. And that was another thing that I couldn't necessarily include in the book because there was so little research that I could find about mixed Nikkei experiences in camp. Because again, I am coming from a place where I'm mixed white Nikkei. So I have that privilege, but there were definitely, mixed Chinese, Japanese Nikkei, mixed Filipino, Japanese Nikkei that I'm sure faced a lot of hardship being in a predominantly Nikkei community where, Chinese, Filipino ancestors are not someone like, they would not be accepted for that, or they would be, shunned for that. So these are sorts of, there's a wide range of experiences that I wish I could have included, but I don't have the perspective on. But calling out that sort of racism within the Japanese American Canadian community, I think, is really important because I think it is something that was, even growing up, and my mom is wonderful and I love her so much, but I think she would tell us sort of stories of her grandmother, casual, like, inter-Asian racism. I would be like, oh God, Mom. So I think, these sorts of things are not ones that we can really afford to just sort of let slide, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've definitely, I mean, so my family, you've met my sister, and I don't, maybe you know a bit about our family, but my families were Japanese Canadian and Chinese Canadian. And definitely, like, there's historic tensions between Japan and China. And I recall my dad mentioning things from elders in my mom's side of the family, like making comments about him without even recognizing the different layers of, like, and that's something that even today, when people find out that, like, I've, like, well, for instance, if I've met someone like a Korean shop owner and they think I'm Korean, but then they find out that I'm part Japanese, and that goes to like Imperial Japan, and like there's just so many, there's a lot of things to unpack in the world. Yeah.
Yes.
Very complex.
Yes. But I think it's why it's important, to really just talk about it all, because I think for so long it's been kind of like, I don't know, avoided in a lot of spaces.
Mm-hmm. Or maybe just we didn't have the language, I think, even.
Yeah, and probably not even
when I was growing up, we didn't have the language to even talk about being a blended or mixed family, because we were just a family, that's just who we were.
Yeah.
Speaking of, you also included, I think there was some images from some of the work that Sue for Solidarity and Densho, who you mentioned in the book. And I'm curious to hear more about what you think the role of Japanese Americans is in today's racial justice movement, with consideration of Black Lives Matter and all the things happening kind of in addition to the pandemic.
Yeah, sort of like what I was saying before, like, I think because incarceration has been so, not universally, but overall the narrative within our country is sort of, this was a bad thing that happened. I think it is important to really highlight those parallels, because, if you don't see that these are the same situation, you can just keep on letting it happen again. And I think that extends even before, before there were physical camps, which of course happened before the 2016 election. There were camps under Obama's administration as well. But it's important to draw the line between, harmful immigration law, with the Chinese Exclusion Act in America. It was sort of one of the early steps towards creating a narrative that, East Asian immigration is bad, they're evil, etc. It's sort of every step of the way, it is a part of it. It doesn't just start and end at camp, I guess.
Totally.
So I think having, a relative privilege of being in a group that is not, actively being persecuted, Japanese Americans right now, I think it is really important to stand up and say, these are the parallels. This is what you have said is bad that happened to us. We are telling you that this is the exact same situation. So, yeah. And sort of being very vocal about that. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Who do you have, like, when you were writing this book, did you have folks in mind who you would hope would access these stories or be reading this?
Yeah, I didn't necessarily. I think definitely I've actually been reached out to by a few yonsei or mixed yonsei who are saying, that they related to that story, and I didn't really even think about that, although it's been very touching, and I'm really honored that they saw themselves in this book. I think I wanted really to show the average sort of American and I guess Canadian, although I admit I don't know as much about Japanese Canadian experiences as I wish I did.
That's okay.
But that, the things that they learned about camp probably in one unit in history class are not complete, and also that the effects of these sorts of racist policy decisions are more long lasting than they probably realize. So I think I think I really just did a scattershot approach where I was like, I hope the average American reader picks this up and learns something and sort of thinks about the long lasting effects of these sorts of racist policies.
Have you heard from any of those folks yet? Like the regular everyday people? People been reaching out to you or commenting on social media about the book?
I am not really sure. I've been avoiding reading reviews. So
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. I will say the book has got really good reviews on Goodreads.
Oh, thank you.
It's really good.
Thank you.
From what I saw when I was researching. Okay, yeah, maybe that's probably healthier actually.
Yeah, my girlfriend is a librarian, and she told me, just don't go on Goodreads. Just don't look at it, because it's, you know, it's for people to remember books themselves and not necessarily think about the authors looking there. So
Right. I guess another thing I want to ask, we're kind of coming up soon. Oh my God, yeah, this is my favorite image. If you can see it shared. So beautiful.
Oh, thanks.
I'm just gonna leave this here for a moment. But I guess I wanted to ask you, so as another artist, and I'm sure there's lots of other artists kind of tuning into this, I'm curious kind of what kind of piece of advice you might want to share with other aspiring artists who want to write their own books, and specifically if you have things you'd want to share with like LGBTQ plus creators of color.
Yeah, definitely just in terms of art, you know, the longest book that I made before this was, I think, 32 pages. And this book was 270 something pages, which seemed impossible. But then it happened. So things, you know, I think that you are capable of things that you didn't realize, and it may take a very long time. But yeah, I think for artists in general, I think you are capable of more than you think you are. And yeah, just keep telling yourself that.
Page by page.
Yeah, exactly. And it feels like it's never going to end, and then it does. And I guess for LGBTQ plus writers and artists, I really think, you know, again, we've always been there, and you don't have to worry too much about historical accuracy, as people may challenge you on, because you know, I think you know in your heart that the stories that you're telling are authentic and are real, and are experiences that are shared throughout, you know, the span of the human experience. So don't let anyone tell you that it's not historically accurate. I think if you're writing a historical one, yeah.
Awesome. That's a great piece of advice. Definitely want to read. Definitely love queer graphic novels. And I guess anything else that you'd like to share with the audience, or, you know, with community members who are watching, whether those are people who are Japanese American or not?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's a really tough time, I think, for all of us, especially those of us who are trying to, you know, really keep up with all the ways in which people are being disenfranchised right now. I think it can feel very overwhelming. I myself have definitely felt kind of hopeless at times. But I do think, you know, yeah, I guess I just want to say thank you, everybody, for supporting this book, and for also doing your best to sort of challenge injustice when you see it, and you know, educate yourselves and think about your place in these societal structures, and try your best to make them a little better and less harmful for everyone. And keep doing that, and I'll see you at the protests every day.
It's a great note for us to kind of wrap up on. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer these questions and chat with me.
Thank you so much for writing such thoughtful questions and for taking the time.
Oh yeah, of course. And for everyone watching, Displacement by Kiku Hughes is now available at your local indie bookstore. And you can follow Kiku Hughes on Twitter at Kiku Hughes, or on Tumblr, geniusb.tumblr.com. My name is Erica Isomura at Erica Hiroko, and this was presented by VanCaf, Vancouver Comic and Arts Festival. Thank you so much, and have a great day.